Let's get right into it. History likes to present itself as a smooth, confident story with a beginning, a middle, and a tidy set of dates you had to memorize in school. It is not. It's a shredded document that fell in a puddle, and roughly 9/10 of the pages are just gone. These are the holes nobody has managed to fill, the moments where the paperwork stops, the experts start hedging, and the honest answer is a shrug. Number 1, the temple that buried itself. Somewhere in southeastern Turkey, on a hill that looks like every other boring hill, there are massive carved stone pillars arranged in rings. Göbekli Tepe. They're covered in carvings of vultures, scorpions, snakes, and various animals you would not want at a dinner party. Some of the pillars weigh as much as a small truck, and they were raised roughly 11,500 years ago. That date is the problem. Not the carvings, not the vultures. The date. Because according to the story everyone agreed on for a century, the order goes: farming first, then villages, then surplus food, then free time, then somebody finally has the spare afternoon to invent religion and monumental architecture. Göbekli Tepe skips the first 4 steps and shows up with the finale. It was built by people who had not domesticated wheat. Hunter-gatherers. Guys whose entire economy was find a gazelle, hope for the best, somehow organizing enough labor to quarry and haul multi-ton limestone pillars into a coordinated ritual complex. So the tidy story is now backwards. Maybe the temple came first and the farming came later because you need to feed all the people who showed up for the temple. That's not a footnote. That's the entire foundation of civilization getting flipped upside down by a hill. And here's the part that keeps archaeologists staring at the ceiling at 3 in the morning. They didn't abandon it. They didn't lose it to a flood or a war. They deliberately backfilled it. Somebody carried in tons of rubble and packed it around those pillars until the whole thing vanished under a mound, on purpose, by hand. Nobody knows why. Retirement ceremony, punishment, cosmic mic drop. The world's first great religious monument was also the world's first great cover-up, and the people who did it left no note. Number 2, the year everything turned off. Picture a wildly connected, wealthy, bureaucratic world. Egypt, the Hittites, Mycenaean Greece, Cyprus, the Levantine trading cities, all of them writing letters to each other, shipping tin and copper across the Mediterranean, complaining about deliveries, arranging royal marriages, a functioning international system with actual diplomatic mail. Then, over roughly 50 years around 1200 BCE, it stops. Not declines. Stops. Peloponnesus burned from Greece to Syria. Cities that had been continuously occupied for centuries are abandoned mid-meal. The Hittite Empire, a genuine superpower, the guys who fought Egypt to a draw at Kadesh, simply ceases to exist. And it's so complete that historians forgot the Hittites existed at all until the 1800s. An entire empire fell out of human memory. Mycenaean Greece loses writing. Loses it. Linear B goes dark for 400 years, and when Greeks start writing again, they've got a brand new alphabet borrowed from Phoenicians because nobody remembers the old one. Egypt survives barely limping and leaves us inscriptions about attackers from the sea. That's most of what we've got. The famous Sea Peoples, which is less a historical identification than a name Egyptian scribes gave to a problem they didn't understand either. The current best guess is that it wasn't one thing. It was drought plus earthquakes plus migration, plus the fact that Bronze Age economies needed tin from thousands of miles away, so cutting one trade route collapsed the whole toolkit. A tangle of interlocking failures that fed each other until the system ate itself. But that's a description of the wreck, not the cause. Nobody can tell you what pushed first. The most sophisticated world of its era went silent, and the black box is missing. 3,000 years later, we're still standing at the crash site, holding a clipboard, guessing. Number 3, the language nobody can read. The Indus Valley civilization was enormous, larger in area than Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, with cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa that had grid-planned streets, standardized fired bricks, public baths, and drainage systems more competent than several places you could name today. 5 million people, more or less, peaking around 4,000 years ago. And they wrote things down. We have thousands of examples, mostly on small carved seals pressed into clay, stamped onto pottery, neat little rows of symbols, fish shapes, jars, human figures, strokes. Nobody can read a word of it. This isn't for lack of trying. It's been attacked by linguists, statisticians, cryptographers, and computers for over a century. The problem is brutally simple. Almost every inscription is tiny. The average one is about 5 signs long. The longest known text is roughly 26 characters, shorter than this sentence. Try reconstructing English from a pile of gas station receipts and you'll get the general idea. Worse, there's no bilingual. Egyptian hieroglyphs cracked because the Rosetta Stone conveniently repeated the same decree in Greek. The Indus script has no Rosetta Stone, no known descendant language, no confident guess at what family it even belongs to. Which turns the whole thing into a political grenade, because what language did they speak maps unpleasantly onto modern arguments about who was in India first. Some researchers have gone further and argued it isn't writing at all, just symbols for trade, ownership tags, religious marks. Statistical analysis pushes back and says the signs have structure, patterns that look like real grammar. So we have a civilization of millions, with plumbing, that talk to us in ink and stone, and we are standing on the other side of the glass reading their lips and getting nothing. They left the message, we lost the decoder ring. Number 4, the Roman legion that walked off the map. The 9th Legion, Legio 9 Hispana. A real unit with a real service record, Britain, the Boudican Revolt, stamped bricks at York with their name on them. Then, somewhere in the early 2nd century, they stop appearing in the record. No triumph, no disbandment notice, no final posting. A legion of thousands of men just isn't mentioned anymore. The romantic version, the one that produced novels and movies, is that they marched north into Caledonia and got annihilated by Picts, and Rome was so embarrassed it scrubbed the name. It's a great story. It's also probably wrong because tiles and inscriptions suggest bits of the 9th turned up later on the continent, possibly in the Netherlands, possibly heading east. So the fashionable answer now is that they were quietly transferred and later chewed up somewhere less cinematic. A Parthian campaign, a revolt in Judea, a bad afternoon on a frontier nobody wrote poetry about. Here's what's actually unsettling, though. Rome was a paperwork empire. These people documented grain shipments, dental complaints, and requests for warmer socks. We have the letters. And they lost track of 5,000 soldiers. If the most obsessively bureaucratic state in the ancient world can misplace an entire legion, consider what happened to everything they didn't bother writing down. Number 5. The book that won't confess. There's a manuscript sitting in a Yale library, about 240 vellum pages, hand-illustrated, carbon-dated to the early 1400s. It's full of plants that don't exist, naked women bathing in networks of green plumbing, astrological wheels, and page after page of flowing, confident handwriting in an alphabet that has never been identified. The Voynich manuscript has been publicly available for over a century and has personally embarrassed some of the best codebreakers alive. The Americans who cracked Japanese naval cipher during World War II took a crack at it in their spare time. Nothing. The obvious explanation is that it's a hoax, medieval nonsense, sold to a gullible collector. Except hoaxes are lazy, and this thing isn't. The text obeys statistical laws that real languages obey, and gibberish generally doesn't. Word frequencies behave. Certain words cluster in the botanical section and vanish in the astronomical one, which is exactly what vocabulary does. Somebody either wrote a real thing in a real system, or faked it with a level of linguistic discipline that would itself be a historic achievement. So the options are a lost language, an unbreakable private cipher, a coded medical text, an elaborate con, or the meticulous life's work of someone whose brain worked differently than everyone else's. 600 years of the smartest people on Earth taking swings, and the book just sits there, beautifully illustrated, saying absolutely nothing anyone can verify. It's the only surviving artifact that has successfully kept a secret from the entire species. Number 6. 16 months without sun. In the year 536, the sky broke. A Byzantine official described a sun that gave light without warmth, like a permanently eclipsed thing hanging up there, for about 18 months. Chinese records mention summer frost and snow. Irish annals note failed bread. Tree rings across the northern hemisphere register a growth collapse, the coldest decade in roughly 2,000 years, starting right then. Ice cores now pin it on volcanoes, probably Iceland, probably 536, followed by another eruption in 540 and another in 547, stacking sulfate veils on top of each other before the atmosphere could clear. Crops died, famine spread, and in 541, plague arrived, the plague of Justinian, into a population that was already starving, killing tens of millions, and helping end any realistic chance of the Roman Empire putting itself back together. Historians have called it the worst year to be alive, and it earns the title. But here's the gap. This is arguably the single most consequential event in the entire post-classical world. The hinge, that Dark Ages half a hemisphere, and we only figured out what happened in the last few decades from bubbles trapped in Greenland ice. It wasn't in the histories. Nobody living through it could name the cause. They just knew the sun had gone gray. For 1,500 years, the biggest catastrophe in a millennium was sitting there unexplained because the perpetrator was a mountain nobody saw erupt. Number 7. The human species we only know. By a fingertip. In 2008, in a cave in Siberia, someone found a fragment of a pinky bone. Girl, roughly 13 years old, about 50,000 years dead. It looked like nothing special. Bone fragments are the archaeological equivalent of loose change. Then they sequenced it, and it wasn't a Neanderthal, and it wasn't us. It was a third kind of human. Nobody had ever suspected it existed. Meet the Denisovans, a population discovered not by finding their skeletons, their tools, their art, or their cities, but by reading a molecular receipt. We know they existed almost entirely from DNA, because the physical evidence is pathetic that pinky, a few teeth, a jawbone, that had been sitting in a Tibetan monastery, a skull fragment or two. You could fit the entire fossil record of an entire branch of humanity into a shoebox and have room for the shoes. And they were not a footnote. They were everywhere. Their DNA shows up in living people from Papua New Guinea to Australia to Southeast Asia, in some populations at several % of the genome. They interbred with Homo sapiens repeatedly in multiple separate populations. One Denisovan gene variant is why Tibetans can breathe at altitude that would put you on the floor. They handed us functional upgrades and then vanished so thoroughly we didn't know their name. We have no idea what their faces look like. We don't know what they made, what they believed, how they sounded, or why they're gone while we're here. A whole sister species of humanity, spread across a continent, sharing beds with our ancestors, and the only reason we know is that a teenage girl broke her finger in the wrong cave and it stayed cold enough for the DNA to survive. Which raises the question nobody enjoys. How many other kinds of people were there? Because the sample size that revealed the Denisovans is one bone chip. The odds we caught all of them are roughly 0. Number 8, the computer. That was 1,400 years early. In 1901, sponge divers pulled a corroded lump of bronze off a shipwreck near the Greek island of Antikythera. It sat in a museum drawer looking like garbage for decades because that's what it looked like. It's a gearbox, a geared analog computer built around the 2nd century BCE with at least 30 interlocking bronze gears cut with triangular teeth, some of them with over 200 teeth apiece, assembled to a precision of a fraction of a millimeter. You turn a crank on the side and it computes positions of the sun and moon, phases, the metonic cycle, eclipse prediction, decades out. The dates of the Olympic Games, because apparently the ancient Greeks wanted a sports calendar built into their astronomical machine. It models the moon's variable speed across the sky using a pin and slot mechanism, a physical solution to an orbital irregularity engineered in bronze 2,000 years before anyone wrote the math down properly. Nothing else like it survives from antiquity. Nothing. The next devices in Europe with that kind of gearing complexity are the astronomical clocks of the 14th century. That's a gap of roughly 1,400 years, during which humanity apparently forgot how to do this. And nobody builds a thing like that on the first try. There's no such thing as a prototype that arrives with 30 perfectly cut gears, which means there was a workshop, a tradition. Predecessors, failures, teachers, students, competitors, an entire lineage of precision engineering that we know existed because we're holding its output, and of which we have exactly one surviving object, and only because a boat sank. Everything else went into the melting pot. Bronze was too valuable to leave lying around. We're not looking at the peak of ancient technology. We're looking at the one piece that got lucky. Number 9, America's forgotten metropolis. Just outside modern St. Louis, there was a city, Cahokia. Around the year 1100, it may have held somewhere between 10 and 20,000 people, bigger than London at the time. It had a central plaza the size of dozens of football fields, over 100 earthen mounds, and a pyramid, Monk's Mound, with a footprint larger than the base of the Great Pyramid of Giza. 14 million baskets of dirt carried by hand, one at a time. It had a wooden solar calendar, planned neighborhoods, suburbs, a trade network pulling shells from the Gulf and copper from the Great Lakes. It was the largest city north of Mexico, and it would not be surpassed by any American city until Philadelphia, around 1800. By 1350, it was empty. There was no conquest, no Europeans within 1,000 miles or a couple of centuries. The people didn't die out. Their descendants are alive and are members of nations that exist today. But the city itself was dismantled and abandoned, and the reasons are still fought over: drought, flooding on the Mississippi, deforestation, political fracture, people simply deciding that whatever Cahokia was selling wasn't worth staying for. Increasingly, the evidence suggests a slow, deliberate walkout rather than a collapse. The gap isn't just why, it's that this was engineered out of public memory. When Europeans arrived and saw the mounds, they refused to believe Native Americans had built them and invented an imaginary lost race to explain it. Vikings, Israelites, Atlanteans, anybody but the people actually standing there. Farmers plowed the mounds flat. One was bulldozed for a highway interchange. A city bigger than London, and most people who live an hour from it have never heard the name. Number 10. The island that ate its own explanation. Everybody knows the Easter Island story. Islanders arrive, chop down every tree to move giant stone heads, wreck their own ecosystem, starve, descend into war and cannibalism. A tidy morality tale about human stupidity taught in classrooms, used in every environmental lecture since the 1990s. The problem is that the archaeology keeps refusing to confirm it. The trees did disappear. That part holds. But the leading suspect now isn't axes, it's rats. Polynesian rats came ashore with the settlers, found palm nuts with no predators, and did what rats do with unlimited calories and no consequences. Gnawed nuts are all over the record. The forest didn't get cut down so much as prevented from ever growing back. The population collapse is worse. The whole "they starved themselves down to nothing" narrative largely doesn't appear in the dates. Radiocarbon evidence suggests the island supported a stable population for centuries after deforestation, farming with rock gardens and stone mulch, techniques that work fine without trees. The catastrophic decline lines up suspiciously well with the arrival of Europeans, their diseases, and the Peruvian slave raids of the 1860s that carried off a huge portion of everyone left, including, incidentally, the people who could read Rongorongo, the island's script, which died with them and has never been deciphered. And the Moai themselves? Experiments show teams can walk them upright with ropes rocking them forward, which matches the islanders' own oral tradition, which always said the statues walked. Everyone dismissed that as myth for 200 years because it sounded like myth. So the most famous cautionary tale in history might be a case of the survivors being blamed for a crime committed partly by rodents and partly by the people writing the story down. And we can't fully settle it because the archive burned twice, once by disease, once by slavers. Number 11. The 14 missing centuries in your own skull. Here's one that isn't buried in a cave. Around 40,000 years ago, human beings started painting caves, carving figurines, burying their dead with grave goods, and making jewelry. Behavioral modernity, the light switching on. Except anatomically, modern humans had already been walking around for something like 250,000 years before that. Same skull, same brain volume, same hardware. 250,000 years of people exactly like you, with exactly your equipment, apparently just not doing it. That's the gap. It's not a missing city or a lost book. It's a missing 250,000 years of human life, and it's roughly 95% of our species' existence. Everything you think of as history is the last 5%, and the other 95% is a blank wall. Some argue the switch never happened, and we've just been fooled by preservation, that the art was there all along, painted on skin and wood and sand, and only the stuff on cave walls survived. Ochre use goes back way further than the famous paintings. Engraved shells push back further still. Maybe there was no revolution, just a slow burn we can't see because the evidence rotted. Others argue something genuinely changed, a cognitive shift, a population density threshold, a language upgrade. Nobody can test it, you can't excavate a thought. So the honest summary of human history is this. For the overwhelming majority of the time our species has existed, we have absolutely no idea what people were doing, thinking, saying, or making. 250,000 years of lives, loves, arguments, inventions, and funerals, and the entire record is a handful of stone tools and some red pigment. We didn't lose a chapter. We lost the book, and we're reconstructing the whole thing from the last page and a coffee stain. Every confident date in your textbook is a rope bridge strung across a canyon nobody has seen the bottom of, and the honest historians will tell you that. The rest just hope you don't look down. That's all for today. I'll be making similar videos in the future. Subscribe to see them. End.